Hi, and welcome to GoGetterEnglish.es. Today we bring you a very important grammar point that you need to master as soon as possible, and that is passive voice. You remember that the passive voice helps us add variety in our language. It also helps us shift the focus from one place to another, and that is exactly what we're going to do today. We're also going to take a look at where we can actually use passive structures in our Cambridge exams, and to top it all off, we'll try to do an exercise together just to see how we can justify whatever we've said today in our lesson in an actual exercise. So stay tuned for a great lesson ahead.
So let's jump right into what these passive sentences are, how we can use these passive structures. So the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, what are passive structures? What is the passive voice? We're going to take a look at that. So once you understand why we need them, why we use them, we are sure you're going to start using them continuously, all right? Because it's such a useful structure in order to emphasize or to focus the attention of the listener onto what you want them to focus on. All right. The second thing we're going to take a look at is, where can we use these passive sentences in the Cambridge exams? There are three very, very differentiated areas. We're going to take a look at that, and we're going to work together with you, and we're going to try and solve and try to complete an exercise using passive structures. Not only passives, we'll see a few more things, but basically it's a passive structure exercise. So let's go right ahead and let's answer our first question. What are these passive sentences? Well, the passive voice is nothing else but shifting the importance or the focus of your sentence to wherever you want it to go. All right? It's shifting the focus to what you consider important. Sometimes, especially when we are reporting news, or when we are, for example, politicians tend to use these very often, basically because they sound a little more formal, but they also have an intention behind each passive sentence. That means they want you to focus on what they want you to focus. All right? So let's take a look at this example. I think with this example, it might become a little clearer. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel. Now, this is a typical English sentence in the past simple, right? Michelangelo, our subject, painted the verb, the Sistine Chapel, our object. Now, let's transform this wonderful active sentence into a passive one. Remember, you must also keep in mind, as a side note, that the passive voice can only be made with transitive verbs. Now, what does this transitive verb means? It means that some verbs in languages require an object to acquire full meaning. And now those are those transitive verbs. So the passive voice can only be made with these transitive verbs. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can transform this active sentence into a passive sentence. Take a look at that. The Sistine Chapel was painted by Michelangelo. Now, in this passive sentence, I wanted to focus a bit more on the Sistine Chapel rather than just Michelangelo. That's why I changed the order of the passive of the sentence, and transformed the verb into the verb to be and the verb in past participle, which we will take a look at right now as to how we can focus on the form of passive sentences using just the verb to be and the past participle. So take a look at that. The Sistine Chapel, which is the object in the active, becomes the subject or the patient in the passive sentence, and Michelangelo, who is the most important part of the active sentence, suddenly is relegated to a more supporting role in our passive sentence. And that the main reason I did this, the only reason I did this, was I wanted to focus more on the object, on the Sistine Chapel, rather than on the subject of the active voice, Michelangelo. And that's why I did this. That's why it's very important to understand what you want to say when you use active or passive voice. Both of them are correct. Both of them have the same meaning. However, the intention behind them might be a little different. I want you to focus on the Sistine Chapel in the passive sentence, and I want you to focus on Michelangelo in the active sentence. And as I said before, passive structures make everything sound very, very formal. And that's great. And that's wonderful. All right. So in the next point, where we are going to be talking about the Cambridge exams, we're going to see how that helps us, give an impression that we know what we are talking about, that we sound a little more formal. We know what we are doing by using passive structures in our exam. So the first thing I want you to focus on, especially when talking about Cambridge exams, is that you shouldn't forget to use passive structures in your writing paper in any of the parts. Include 3, 4, 5 passive structures in those tasks. All right, try to do so, because it makes you sound a bit more formal logically, and the examiner gets the impression that you want to stress what you want to stress. The importance of certain parts of the writing paper. Now, the second place where you might find yourself using passive structure is, of course, in the speaking part. Again, you want to show off your skills while speaking. Try to use some passive sentences in all the parts on all the sections of the speaking part. All right, specifically in part 2 or part 3, if you're in the proficiency, that's where you need to shine, and that's where you need to show your mastery of passive structures. And the third place you might find yourself using passive structures is in the reading and use of English part 4. The keyword transformation. They might give you a sentence in active, and you might be asked to actually change it into passive. All right, they might ask you a couple of things more, maybe a phrasal verb that needs to be changed, or an idiomatic expression that needs to be used, but you will surely be asked to transform it into a passive sentence. Let's take a look, before we move on to our exercise today, a bit about the form of passive structures. Now, as you already know, I'm pretty sure you are very familiar with the basic passive structure, and this is none other than the verb to be plus past participle. Now, of course, the verb to be is a great auxiliary verb that works very well because it's easy to transform to different tenses. Now, that's something you should keep in mind. If we are talking about the past and you want to make a passive in the past, you might need to use the verb to be in the past. So that's what will always change. The verb to be is the one that keeps changing in order to adapt to the tense of your sentence, to the intention of your sentence. All right, that would be the verb to be. That's the one that's going to help you do that. And of course, the past participle is always going to remain as in the past participle. All right, remember the third column in your irregular verbs list, and if it's a regular verb, then it's ed, ending in ed. You wouldn't have to worry about that. So let's take a look at some of the most common forms in these tenses. Like the present simple is the verb to be is, or are if it's plural. Present continuous, don't forget to use is being. Although it sounds a little odd, it is very common. All right, my room is being cleaned right now. All right, somebody is cleaning my room. Of course you can say that, but you wanted to focus a little bit on the room rather on who is cleaning your room. All right, the past simple, all the way to future perfect. And of course we can also use it in the conditional. We can use passive structures in the conditional, like would be made, would be done, if you had. Okay, try to think of those as such. All right, well, let's go ahead and take a look at a very, very useful form of passive structures. Sometimes actions actually happen to you in a passive way. All right, you didn't do the actions, but they actually had an effect on you. That's when we use causative passive structures. Now, what do we mean by causative passive structures? Let me ask you a simple question. Do you cut your hair? Do you physically cut your hair? Most probably you don't. Somebody cuts your hair. Somebody does that for you, right? It has an effect on you. Now, whenever we want to express that, in English, we tend to use this particular structure. So let's take a look at this. I get my hair cut at the hairdresser's once a month. I get my hair cut at the hairdresser's once a month. Now, in this case, the focus is you, but you are not doing the action. You're actually receiving that action. This is what we call a causative use of the passive. All right? Causative use of the passive. All right? Like you probably didn't paint your house this summer. Somebody painted it for you. So I got my house painted this summer. You didn't do anything. You had it done to you. All right? So take a look at that. That's the causative use of the passive. Well, let's go right ahead and take a look at our exercise of the day. So take a look at that. Today we're going to be talking about the scramjet. This is a wonderful exercise taken from the book Destinations C1. If you don't have that book yet, you need to get a hold of that book. It's a wonderful book to actually practice your grammar and vocabulary. So let's take a look at this exercise together. Imagine transported around the globe. Now the first blank is already kind of a conundrum here. Now, after verbs like imagine, where there's no subject, there's no actual subject, or consider, all right, where we suppose the subject is you, all right. After these two verbs, imagine and consider, you will always find a verb in an ing form, in the gerund form. And since we've been talking about passive structures, which verb do you think might be missing here to complete the verb to be plus past participle formula that we need for our passive structures? Please keep in mind that imagine is one of those verbs that requires gerund forms. So yes, you guessed it right. The correct verb is being. Imagine being transported around the globe in a matter of hours, rather than the 24 hours which currently required to get from London to Sydney. Now, this particular blank is again asking us to put in a verb to be, right? The past participle of the verb required is right there. There's an adverb in between, currently. So we assume that we are looking for the verb to be in the correct form, logically, in that particular blank. Now, it is very tempting to actually think that the right answer here is, which is currently required to get from London to Sydney. But my dear people, we are talking about 24 hours, which is plural. So don't fall into that trap and try to put the verb to be in the correct person, all right? In this case, referring to plurals, all right? The 24 hours which are currently required to get from London to Sydney. Such is the promise of the scramjet, a highly experimental type of engine which has been development over the past couple of decades. Now, over here, there's kind of a trick, because we are not talking about a passive structure here. We cannot make that passive structure here because we have no past participle to complement it with. All right? So we might be looking for probably a collocation here. So there's a preposition that we might be looking for. All right? And in this case, we tend to use under with development. These are verbs that words that naturally go together. If you had thought about using in development, that would also be totally correct. So, great job there. So, which has been under development over the past couple of decades. In a conventional jet engine, air sucked into the engine at speeds below the speed of sound. Now, over here, it seems like the text is trying to describe a process. Remember that we tend to use passive sentences whenever processes or operations are described. Whenever we describe a process, we tend to use passive structures. Take a look at a recipe. Whenever you're cooking and following a recipe, everything will be written in passives, as in sugar is then added to the mixture. The oven is then preheated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Now take a look at that. whenever we follow a process, all right, you explain a procedure, we tend to use the passive structures. So take a look at that. In a conventional jet engine, air, we assume it's something that happens all the time in a conventional jet engine, air is sucked into the engine at speeds below the speed of sound. It's the only verb to be that we needed, all right, and we did that in the present simple because it was something we assume happens all the time, all right. Into the engine at speeds below the speed of sound, where it is mixed fuel. Another collocation. Over here, the preposition with. Mixed with fuel, ignited, and the exhaust gases provide thrust. In a scramjet, which has to taken to supersonic speeds by conventional means, now in this case, the scramjet needs some help actually getting to those supersonic speeds. So why not use a passive here, which has to be taken to supersonic speeds by conventional means before it will operate. The air enters at supersonic speeds. Now, this next blank is very, very typical in English, which is the impersonal use of it. All right, it's kind of a very common passive structure. It has estimated. That means somebody actually carried out those estimations. So we would just need the verb to be in past participle here because it's a present perfect passive. It has been estimated that a scramjet might be capable of traveling at 12 to 24 times the speed of sound. However, the technology been found to be extremely difficult to control. Now over here, what we are missing is the auxiliary verb that completes that passive, which is none other than has. Although scientists had scramjets perform short flights, commercial aircrafts are still a long way in the future. Although scientists had scramjets perform. Now take a look at this structure. Take a look at this structure. It's present perfect. We assume that, all right, because to have had would be the correct answer here. We are looking for something that completes that past participle, and the only one that would do it in the present perfect is the auxiliary verb have. Now, to have something do something, all right, take a look at that. Although scientists have had scramjets perform short flights, that means they have done the job of actually getting those short flights off the ground, all right, to have something to have had something done at some point. All right. Although scientists have had scramjets perform short flights, commercial aircraft are still a long way in the future and indeed may never successfully developed. Another passive structure, in this case using some modal auxiliary verbs. In this case may, and then an adverb never, and then another adverb successfully developed. Now the only thing we would be missing here is, of course, is if we are using a modal auxiliary verb, we always need a bare infinitive, an infinitive without to, which in this case is the verb to be, in order to make our last passive sentence. Well, thank you so much for having followed our lesson on passive structures on the passive voice today, and we hope to see you in another lesson very soon. We here at Go Getter English want to say see you and catch you next time.